On December 8, 1982, the quiet town of Ada, Oklahoma was shattered by a brutal crime that would haunt it for decades. Debbie Carter, a 21-year-old waitress, was found raped and murdered in her apartment. The scene was horrific blood smeared on the walls, signs of a violent struggle, and messages scrawled in ketchup and fingernail polish. Debbie had been strangled with a cord and suffocated with a washcloth stuffed in her throat. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case quickly. In a town where everyone knew everyone, fear and suspicion rippled through the community. Yet beneath the urgency for answers, the investigation would soon veer off course, guided less by evidence and more by desperation. The true horror was not just the crime itself, but how the pursuit of justice would go so terribly wrong. In the absence of solid leads, the Ada Police Department turned to familiar names: Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz. Williamson had once been a hometown hero, a promising baseball player whose shot at the major leagues had been derailed by injury and mental illness. By the early 1980s, he was back in Ada, living with his mother, battling schizophrenia, and drifting through life with erratic behavior that made him an easy target. Fritz, a quiet schoolteacher and widowed father, had no criminal record, but his friendship with Williamson drew suspicion. Investigators built their case, not on physical evidence, but on circumstantial connections, rumor, and gut instinct. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no forensic proof linking either man to Debbie Carter's murder. Yet, in 1987, 5 years after the crime, both were arrested. Fritz was charged with aiding and abetting the murder. Williamson, accused of being the killer, faced the death penalty. It was a case built on sand, but it was moving forward with the full weight of the law behind it. As the trial approached, the prosecution faced a glaring problem: the lack of physical evidence linking Ron Williamson or Dennis Fritz to Debbie Carter's murder. To fill that void, they turned to testimony. Unreliable, uncorroborated, and, as it would later turn out, utterly deceptive. One of their key witnesses was Glen Gore, a local man with a well-known history of violence and a direct connection to the victim. Gore had been at the same bar as Debbie the night she was killed, and witnesses recalled him acting aggressively toward her. He had even threatened her that evening. But instead of being treated as a suspect, Gore was cast as a helpful insider, a witness to the alleged confession of the accused. In court, Gore claimed that Ron Williamson had admitted to the crime during a jailhouse conversation. The story was entirely fabricated. There was no record, no corroboration, just the word of a man who would later be exposed as the killer. Yet, his testimony became a central pillar of the state's case. It was a devastating irony. While the real murderer described a false confession to convict someone else, he managed to walk free, shielded by his performance on the witness stand. The justice system had not only missed the killer, it had used him to help build a case against the wrong men. Dennis Fritz, born in 1949, also hailed from Ada. A dedicated family man, he worked as a school teacher and was raising his daughter following the untimely death of his wife. Fritz led a quiet life, marked by his commitment to education and his role as a single parent. His connection to Williamson was primarily through their shared community, and there was no indication of any criminal behavior in his past. Despite their disparate paths, both men found themselves ensnared in a legal nightmare, their lives irrevocably altered by a justice system that failed to protect the innocent. Ron Williamson's mental illness had been well documented long before he ever became a suspect. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and prone to delusions, he had cycled in and out of psychiatric institutions for years. Yet in 1987, after his arrest, he was subjected to a prolonged police interrogation while still in a vulnerable mental state. Desperate for answers and convinced of his guilt, investigators pressed him for a confession. What they got instead was a rambling account of dreams, disjointed, surreal visions in which he imagined being in Debbie Carter's apartment, touching her, possibly hurting her. These were not confessions by any legal or factual standard. They were the confused fragments of a man in psychological distress. Still, prosecutors seized on this so-called dream confession as the cornerstone of their case. In court, it was presented not as the delusion of a mentally ill man, but as the spontaneous admission of a guilty conscience. The jury heard it without the context of Williamson's diagnosis, his medication, or his institutional history. To them, it sounded like truth. And so, a dream, an incoherent, involuntary product of a broken mind, was transformed into the evidence that helped sentence an innocent man to death. It was a chilling example of how the justice system can bend reality to fit its own narrative, even at the cost of someone's life. With no physical evidence and a fragile confession built on dreams, the prosecution turned to another unreliable source to reinforce their case: an inmate named Terry Holland. Holland was a repeat offender with a long criminal history and a reputation for trading information for leniency. She claimed that while in jail, Ron Williamson had confessed the details of Debbie Carter's murder to her. Her story arrived conveniently and echoed what prosecutors needed to hear. There was no recording, no witnesses, and no independent verification, only her word. The tactic was not new. Jailhouse informants like Holland often received reduced sentences or special treatment in exchange for testimony, and her role in the trial fit that familiar pattern. Despite her credibility being questionable at best, her statements were introduced in court as genuine evidence. The jury, already swayed by the dream confession and Gore's fabricated testimony, was now presented with yet another layer of falsehood. Years later, Holland would admit she had lied. She had never heard any confession. She made the story up to get a deal. But by then, the damage was done. Her words had helped put Williamson on death row and Fritz behind bars. In a system that prizes convictions over truth, her lie was just another tool, effective, damning, and nearly fatal for the innocent men it targeted. By the early 1990s, Ron Williamson had exhausted nearly all his legal options. Despite glaring flaws in the case and his declining mental health, the courts upheld his conviction. The state of Oklahoma set an execution date, September 24th, 1994. As the clock ticked down, Williamson was placed on death watch, confined in a small cell just feet from the execution chamber. He was 5 days from being killed for a crime he did not commit. It wasn't new evidence that saved him. It wasn't a confession from the real killer or a last-minute witness. It was, instead, a ruling from the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which found that Williamson had received inadequate legal representation at trial. His defense had failed to fully investigate or present evidence of his severe mental illness. That failure, the court concluded, undermined the fairness of the entire proceeding. The stay of execution was a narrow escape, one born of legal procedure, not justice. Had the court acted a week later, Williamson would have been dead. The system had come shockingly close to executing an innocent man, and yet the revelation did little to shake the confidence of those who had built the case against him. For Williamson, the delay was a reprieve, not freedom. He returned to his cell, still facing charges, still branded a killer, and still locked in the nightmare that had nearly cost him his life. In 1999, science finally succeeded where the justice system had failed. With advances in DNA testing, evidence from the original crime scene, biological material collected from Debbie Carter's body and apartment, was re-examined. The results were clear and irrefutable. Neither Ron Williamson nor Dennis Fritz had been involved in the crime. Their DNA did not match any of the samples. They were innocent. But the test results revealed something more damning. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched Glen Gore, the man who had once testified against Williamson, the same man who had threatened Debbie Carter the night she was murdered. For 17 years, Gore had walked free. He had watched others stand trial for his crime, even testifying to help convict them. In all that time, the truth had been buried in the evidence, waiting for science to catch up. Williamson and Fritz were officially exonerated and released from prison. Their convictions were vacated, and the state's case collapsed. For the first time, the narrative was no longer based on dreams, lies, or desperate conjecture. It was grounded in fact. DNA didn't just exonerate two innocent men, it exposed the foundation of a false conviction and pointed directly to the real killer. It was a revelation that turned the entire case on its head and forced a painful reckoning with a system that had so catastrophically failed. The exoneration of Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz should have prompted accountability. Instead, it met a wall of denial. Bill Peterson, the district attorney who prosecuted the case, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. He did not apologize to the men whose lives had been destroyed. He expressed no remorse for building a case on faulty evidence, coerced testimony, and unreliable witnesses. Even when Glen Gore was arrested and charged with the murder, Peterson maintained the integrity of his original prosecution. Peterson's unwillingness to confront the truth wasn't just a personal failing, it reflected a deeper institutional problem. He went on to prosecute other controversial cases, including that of Thomas Ward and Carl Fontenot, two more men convicted of murder under questionable circumstances. Like Williamson and Fritz, their convictions relied on coerced confessions and flawed investigative work. The same patterns repeated: pressure to solve a crime, a rush to judgment, and a disregard for truth in favor of narrative. For the wrongfully convicted, vindication brought no real justice. The very people responsible for their imprisonment faced no consequences. There were no criminal charges, no disbarments, no professional sanctions. The system had nearly taken Ron Williamson's life, stolen Dennis Fritz's freedom, and ignored Glen Gore's violence. But the architects of that failure walked away unchanged. In the end, it wasn't just the courts that betrayed these men. It was the people who were supposed to protect justice itself. Though Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz were free, their lives were forever altered. Released from prison in 1999, after nearly 12 years of wrongful imprisonment, they faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding their lives. For Fritz, the road ahead was daunting, but filled with hope. He returned to his hometown, reunited with his daughter, and began to rebuild his teaching career. His resilience, despite the trauma, allowed him to slowly reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But for Williamson, freedom came with an insurmountable weight. The years spent in a small, isolated cell, subjected to the cruelty of a system that had failed him, had taken a deep toll. He struggled with PTSD, severe depression, and alcoholism, haunted by the memories of his time on death row. His mental health, already fragile before his arrest, deteriorated further. The world he returned to was foreign, filled with reminders of the life he had lost. Friends and family had moved on, and the stigma of being wrongfully convicted followed him everywhere. The emotional and psychological scars ran deep. Ron Williamson, a man whose potential had once shone bright, had been crushed by a flawed system. His spirit, like his body, had been broken. Tragically, in 2004, just 5 years after his exoneration, Ron Williamson died from cirrhosis of the liver, brought on by years of heavy drinking, likely a coping mechanism for the trauma he endured. He was 51 years old. His death was a reminder that, for many who have been wrongfully convicted, freedom does not always come with healing. The system that failed him didn't just steal his years, it robbed him of his future. The story of Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz doesn't end with their release from prison. In many ways, it is just the beginning of a larger conversation about the systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold. Their case shines a harsh light on the deeply ingrained flaws in the justice system, particularly when it comes to the treatment of the mentally ill, the use of unreliable witnesses, and the abuse of forensic evidence. The wrongful conviction of two innocent men for a crime they did not commit reveals just how easily the system can fail, and how it often does, especially when it comes to capital punishment. One of the most significant outcomes of the case was the role DNA evidence played in proving their innocence. While forensic science had long been a pillar of criminal investigations, Williamson and Fritz's case underscored both the potential and the limitations of DNA testing. For these men, DNA did what the justice system could not. It exposed the truth. But the reality is that, without this breakthrough, they may have never been freed. Their exoneration is a powerful reminder of why the use of modern forensic science is critical, but also why it must be handled with extreme caution and integrity. However, the emotional and psychological toll of wrongful conviction cannot be understated. For Williamson, the years spent on death row, and the trauma of living through a system that had not only failed him but nearly executed him left permanent scars. The guilt, shame, and pain of being labeled a killer took years to unravel, but the damage was done. Even after exoneration, he could never fully escape the shadow of what had been taken from him. Fritz, on the other hand, though granted a second chance at life, faced a world forever changed, one where the man he was before prison no longer existed. Rebuilding a life after such a profound injustice is a lifelong struggle, and in many cases, no amount of legal victory can undo the emotional devastation caused by wrongful imprisonment. Perhaps the most troubling element of their case is the lack of accountability for those responsible. Prosecutor Bill Peterson, who built the case against them, never apologized, nor did he face any consequences for his role in sending 2 innocent men to prison. The use of junk science, coerced confessions, and unreliable witnesses went unchecked, and the system that allowed this to happen failed to hold anyone accountable. This raises critical questions about the integrity of the justice system and the necessity for real reform. Without accountability for those who contribute to wrongful convictions, the cycle of injustice will continue. Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz's story is not just one of personal tragedy and triumph. It is a reflection of the very real and present dangers of a justice system that, despite its noble ideals, too often falters under pressure, prejudice, and procedural failure. It's a cautionary tale that demands attention and action from all who believe in true justice. The Williamson and Fritz tragedy stands as both a warning and a call to action for a justice system that routinely fails those it's meant to protect. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. How can we, as individuals and as a society, work to safeguard against the devastating consequences of a system gone wrong? If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the story. If you're interested in more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a great story. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.